This wasn't a battle, it was a termination. On the 23rd of January, 1870, U.S. soldiers aimed their rifles not at warriors, but down into the tops of teepees where families were sleeping, many already dying from smallpox. They weren't just killing people, they were killing the defenseless. This is the story of the Marias Massacre, where the objective wasn't victory, but extermination, and the victims were guilty of nothing more than being in the way. But an event like this doesn't happen in a vacuum. It was the final, bloody chapter in a story that began years earlier. A story of crossed lines, broken trust, and a single, violent grudge that would doom hundreds. The Montana Territory in the late 1860s was a landscape of simmering resentment. The relationship between the Niitsitapi, the Blackfeet Confederacy, and the encroaching American settlers was less a negotiation and more a slow-burning fuse. For years, the conflict had followed a predictable, ugly pattern. Settlers pushed onto treaty lands, consuming resources, and in response, some Blackfeet warriors raided settlements and stole livestock, particularly horses. It was a cycle of provocation and retaliation. By 1869, an uneasy and unofficial border had formed at the Marias River. North of it was Blackfeet country. South of it was the world of the white settlers, a world that was growing more paranoid and less patient every day. At the center of this tension was a man who seemed to embody all of its contradictions. Malcolm Clark. Clark was a rancher and trader, but he was no simple frontiersman. He was a former West Point cadet kicked out for brawling who happened to be friends with General William Tecumseh Sherman. More importantly, Clark was married to a Piegan Blackfeet woman named Kothko Kona, a union that gave him 4 children and a crucial trading alliance with her people. But this connection to the Blackfeet world was constantly at war with his own nature. Described by those who knew him as a man of fierce and ungovernable temper, Clark was a walking storm. He had once killed a rival from the American Fur Company and operated with a sense of impunity, a man straddling 2 cultures while respecting the rules of neither. The fuse was finally lit by a young Piegan warrior named Owl Child. In 1867, he took horses from Malcolm Clark's ranch. To Owl Child, this wasn't simple theft, it was a matter of honor and retribution, believing Clark had cheated him in a previous horse trade. Clark's response was not to seek justice through any official channel. Instead, he and his son Horace hunted Owl Child down. They didn't just reclaim their property, they administered a punishment designed to inflict maximum shame. They beat and whipped Owl Child in front of other Blackfeet, a profound public humiliation. In a culture where physical disgrace was a stain that could only be washed away with blood, this act was a death sentence, just not for Owl Child. Blackfeet oral tradition holds that Clark's violence went even further, alleging he raped Owl Child's wife during the confrontation. This act of ultimate violation transformed a personal feud into an unforgivable war. 2 years of simmering rage came to a head on the 17th of August, 1869. Owl Child, backed by a small party of warriors, descended on the Clark ranch. They shot and wounded Horace, then confronted Malcolm Clark. A bullet to the chest dropped the formidable rancher before Owl Child finished the job with an axe. As one contemporary observer noted of Indian-white relations, you either kill a man outright or leave him alone, because if you strike him, he will surely kill you when you least expect it. Malcolm Clark had struck, and now he was dead. The murder of a prominent white man with connections to the military elite sent a shockwave of panic and fury through Montana. Settlers demanded that the government finally solve their Indian problem. The U.S. Army responded by issuing an ultimatum to the Blackfeet leadership: find Owl Child, execute him, and deliver his body within 2 weeks. But Owl Child was long gone, having fled north to seek refuge with Mountain Chief's band, a group known to be hostile to settlers but not actively raiding them. When the deadline passed with no body, General Philip Sheridan, a man who believed in total war, issued a chillingly clear order to Major Eugene M. Baker. He was to find Mountain Chief's band and strike them hard. The hunt for one man was over. A punitive expedition, aimed at an entire village, was about to begin, marching straight into the heart of a Montana winter. Major Eugene Baker's column moved through the Montana winter like a frozen blade. They had left Fort Ellis on the 6th of January, 1870, a mix of U.S. cavalry and infantry, pushing through bitter cold and deep snow with a singular, brutal purpose. Along the way, they picked up reinforcements, including 2 scouts, Joe Kipp and Joseph Cobell. men who knew this land and its people intimately. Their presence was supposed to ensure precision, but as the soldiers marched, a different element was shaping their destiny. Men who were on the march with Baker later reported that he drank heavily throughout the expedition, his judgment clouded by whiskey and a grim determination to follow his orders to strike them hard. The mission was already poisoned from within, long before the first shot was fired. On the 22nd of January, the command got the lead they were looking for. They captured a small group of Piegan hunters who, under interrogation, told Baker that the hostile camps he sought were just a few miles downriver. Believing he was closing in on Mountain Chief, Baker ordered a forced march through the dead of night. His men, exhausted and freezing, scrambled over the broken, icy terrain, their minds fixed on a dawn attack. As the first pale light of the 23rd of January broke across the sky, they arrived at a bluff overlooking the Marias River. Below them, nestled in the trees, was a silent village of dozens of painted teepees. For the soldiers, it was the perfect tactical position. A natural firing range with a vulnerable target laid out beneath them. But for the scout Joe Kipp, the sight was not a triumph. It was a horrifying mistake. His eyes scanned the familiar, intricate designs painted on the tipi hides. These were not the markings of Mountain Chief's warriors. He knew them instantly. This was the village of Chief Heavy Runner, a leader who had consistently sought peace with the whites and who carried papers from the U.S. government to prove it. The men in this village were not raiders. They were hunters and families who trusted in the promise of safety. Kipp spurred his horse and galloped toward Major Baker, desperate to stop the inevitable. He explained the catastrophic error. This was the wrong camp, the wrong people, a band of friendly Blackfeet who had nothing to do with Malcolm Clark's death. Major Baker listened, his gaze fixed on the village below. Then he gave his reply, a sentence that would condemn over 100 people to death. "That makes no difference," he said. "One band or another of them. They are all Piegans, and we will attack them." The distinction between guilty and innocent had been erased. For Baker, they were all the same. To ensure there would be no last-minute warnings, he ordered a sergeant to stand over Joe Kipp with a rifle, telling the man to shoot the scout dead if he tried to alert the sleeping camp. Defying the order, Kipp screamed a warning into the frozen air anyway and was immediately arrested and removed. The last voice of reason was silenced. Baker's men took their positions on the ridge, looking down at the silent community. They couldn't know the full extent of the tragedy they were about to unleash. The village they were about to attack was not just peaceful. It was a hospital. A smallpox epidemic had swept through the camp, leaving its people grievously ill. To make matters worse, most of the band's healthy men and warriors were away on a winter hunt. The roughly 80 lodges below were filled almost exclusively with women, children, the elderly, and men too sick to even stand, let alone fight. The soldiers took aim, not at an army, but at a sleeping, defenseless, and plague-ridden community. The termination was about to begin. From his position on the ridge, Major Baker gave his final orders. He didn't shout. In a low voice, he told his men to keep cool, aim to kill, to spare none of the enemy, and then he gave the command to fire. The first coordinated volley ripped through the frozen morning air, a sound that instantly shattered the peace of the Piegan camp. The noise jolted Chief Heavy Runner awake. Hearing the attack, he did exactly what his trust in the U.S. government told him to do. He ran from his lodge, not with a weapon, but with his safe conduct paper, a legal document meant to guarantee his safety. Waving it above his head, he shouted toward the soldiers on the bluff, trying to stop the impossible from happening. He was shot down immediately, the first man to die. In a twisted postscript, the scout Joseph Cobell later claimed he fired that first shot, a calculated sacrifice to convince the army this was the right village, thereby protecting the actual camp of Mountain Chief further downriver. With Heavy Runner dead, the full force of the cavalry was unleashed. The soldiers' first volley was aimed low, deliberately tearing through the hide walls of the teepees to kill the people sleeping inside their beds. From the natural fortress of the bluff, they poured relentless fire down into the village. Those who survived the initial onslaught rushed out of their lodges in terror, men, women, many holding infants in their arms only to be systematically shot down as they emerged into the open. Spearwoman, just 6 years old, remembered waking to the sounds of dogs barking just before she saw Heavy Runner fall. She scrambled into a nearby tipi and hid, watching in terror as soldiers went from lodge to lodge, murdering her people. A soldier eventually slashed a hole in the tipi she was hiding in, peering inside to shoot anyone who moved. After the initial volleys had suppressed any possible resistance, the soldiers descended from the ridge and charged into the camp itself, shifting the massacre from a long-distance exercise to an intimate butchery. The violence became personal and sadistic. One soldier, William Berth, would later boast of the slaughter. He described how they used butcher knives to slit open the tipi covers and shoot the unarmed, terrified people huddled within. "We killed some with axes," he bragged, calling it an awful massacring. Other soldiers developed a different technique. They fired at the tops of the lodges, severing the ropes that held them together. The heavy poles would collapse inward, dropping the hide covers directly into the lodge fires, turning the homes into inescapable traps that suffocated and burned the occupants alive. From the perspective of those on the ground, it was a hellish, incomprehensible storm of violence. Buffalo Trail women watched as soldiers surrounded a single tipi and fired into it from all sides at once, ensuring no one could survive. When the killing subsided, the looting began. The soldiers moved through the dead and dying, taking buffalo robes, blankets, and anything of value. Barehead, who had been captured just outside the camp while tending to horses, was forced to watch the entire ordeal. He saw his leader fall. He saw the lodges of his own family collapse into the flames, killing his mother, his father's 3 other wives, and their 4 young daughters. He saw soldiers shoot the wounded and then begin piling the bodies. Finally, they set fire to everything that remained: the tipis, the supplies, and the dead, creating a massive funeral pyre, fueled by the bodies of his people. The only thought that ran through his mind as he watched the flames consume his world was a single, agonizing wish: that the soldiers had killed him too. When the shooting on the Marias River finally stopped, the cold reality of what had occurred came into focus, not in stories, but in numbers. The official U.S.-led lists Army reports would eventually claim 173 Indians killed. Later, more thorough accounts based on survivor testimony would put the number closer to 200. The breakdown of the dead tells the true story of that morning. Of the Piegan victims, only about 15 were considered fighting-age men between 12 and 37 years old. The rest were 90 women and 55 children under the age of 12. On the other side, the U.S. cavalry suffered a single casualty. 1 private killed. Another soldier broke his leg after falling from his horse. It wasn't a battle, it was an extermination, with a casualty ratio that speaks only to slaughter. The violence, however, did not end with the last gunshot. As the smoke cleared, a second, more methodical phase of cruelty began. The soldiers moved through the ruined village to deal with the aftermath. According to later accounts, this meant putting the last wounded woman and child out of their misery, a cold euphemism for executing survivors who were too injured to flee. Once the living were silenced, the troops began the work of erasing the evidence. They dragged the corpses into piles, throwing them on top of the ruined lodges, firewood, and what little household property remained. Then they set it all ablaze, creating a massive, foul-smelling pyre designed to wipe the camp and its people from the face of the earth. To ensure the destruction was complete, they also burned the tribe's entire winter food supply, a final act of brutality condemning any who might have escaped into the wilderness to starvation. In the midst of this, Major Baker rounded up the remaining survivors, approximately 140 women and children, intending to take them as prisoners to Fort Ellis. For a brief moment, it might have seemed like the most horrific part was over. But when Baker's medical officer discovered that many of the captives were suffering from the smallpox epidemic that had already ravaged the camp, the major made his final cruel decision of the day. He wasn't going to risk bringing a plague back to his fort. Instead of offering aid or mercy, he simply let them go. He abandoned 140 women and children, many of them sick and all of them in shock, to the unforgiving Montana winter with no food, no shelter, and no protection. It was a death sentence, delivered not by a bullet, but by frost and starvation. Years later, a visitor to the site of the massacre found that the Army's attempt to burn away the evidence had failed. The land itself had preserved the truth. Scattered throughout the long grass and brush, he saw the gleaming white skulls and bones of those who were slaughtered, left exactly where wolves and foxes had dragged them. He was haunted by a single question: how could they have done it? The soldiers were not drunk or in the grip of battle frenzy. They were in no danger whatsoever. They had, as he put it, deliberately, coolly, with steady and deadly aim, shot down defenseless people, killed the wounded, and tried to burn the bodies. The horror of the Marias Massacre wasn't just in the killing, but in the cold, calm efficiency with which it was carried out. In the aftermath of the Marias Massacre, A second war began. A war over the story itself. Major Eugene Baker, in his official report, began crafting a fiction designed for public consumption. He claimed to have fought a pitched battle, killing 120 able men and only 53 women and children. He went even further, insisting that every effort was made by officers and men to save the non-combatants, and that the dozens of women and children who died were killed accidentally in the crossfire. It was a lie constructed to transform a slaughter into a victory, but the truth had a way of seeping through the cracks. The local Indian agent, William Pease, interviewed survivors and officers and filed a very different report. Only 15 of the dead were young men of fighting age. The rest were old men, women, and children. The numbers told a story of massacre, not of battle. The men on the ground knew the truth. The scout, Joe Kipp, who had tried to stop the attack, later put the total dead at 217 and confirmed that Major Baker was drunk that morning. Fearing for his life, Kipp refused to give an official interview, convinced the army would have him hanged for contradicting his commander. The most damning admission, however, came from Baker's own superior, Colonel de Trobriand. When pressed about the age and sex of the victims, he gave a cynically honest reply. How could he know? De Trobriand openly admitted that everyone knew Baker had attacked a friendly camp, and that the actual target, Mountain Chief's band, was safely across the border in Canada at the time of the attack. The lie was exposed from within the very command structure meant to uphold it. When the real story leaked to the eastern United States, it ignited a firestorm of public outrage. Newspapers assailed General Sheridan for giving the order, and one furious congressman took to the floor to declare that civilization shudders at horrors like this. But this moral indignation was met with a wall of denial and defiance from the West. The citizens of Montana and Baker's military superiors rushed to his defense, painting him as a hero who had protected settlers. One local journalist venomously dismissed the Eastern critics as namby-pamby, sniffling old-maid sentimentalists who simply didn't understand the realities of the frontier. In the end, the backlash mattered more than the truth. Major Baker and the men who followed his orders to spare none never faced a court-martial, an inquiry, or any form of punishment for their actions. The system protected its own. Ironically, the sheer, undeniable brutality of the massacre had a profound and lasting political impact, just not the one Sheridan and the army intended. At the time, a powerful movement was underway to transfer the Bureau of Indian Affairs from the Civilian Department of the Interior to the Department of War. The Marias Massacre single-handedly killed that movement. The event was so horrific that it convinced Congress and President Ulysses S. Grant that the military could not be trusted with the lives of Native Americans. Grant swiftly moved to solidify his peace policy, issuing an executive order that all Indian agents would be civilians, not soldiers, effectively walling the army out of Indian affairs. Baker's act of war had cost the Department of War its power. While politicians in Washington debated policy, the Blackfeet Nation was left shattered. Already weakened by the smallpox epidemic, the terror inflicted by Baker's troops left them psychologically broken and unable to mount any kind of retaliation. They came to see the Americans as a uniformly savage people from whom no mercy could be expected. This fear was precisely the strategic outcome the army had hoped for. The massacre paved the way for the final dispossession of Blackfeet land. With the tribe pacified by terror, President Grant issued executive orders in 1872 and 1873 that carved away huge swaths of their reservation territory for settlement. The slaughter had served its ultimate purpose. As for the men at the center of the tragedy, their legacies ended not with a bang, but a whimper. Malcolm Clark's family, caught between the two worlds their father had tried to dominate, struggled to find a place. His son Horace was forever haunted by the violence he'd witnessed, and another son was killed a few years later. Major Eugene Baker, the architect of the massacre, was never held accountable for the dead on the Marias. His career was ultimately destroyed by his own demons. After being arrested for public drunkenness in 1872, he was quietly demoted to the inglorious job of purchasing horses for the army. The man who ordered a massacre was undone not by justice, but by alcoholism. The slaughter was called a mistake, but the outcome was the intention all along: a people broken, a land opened, and a story buried under 100 official lies. The army got its revenge for one man by slaughtering an innocent village. The Marias Massacre wasn't a mistake. It was a Massaja, story of betrayal, where the official report was the final act of slaughter. History isn't written by the victors so much as it's covered up by them. How many other victories were just massacres we chose to forget? There are more buried stories out there. Subscribe and let's go digging.